Yeah, so snake oil. Um, Actually, what I'm going to do is take a very pragmatic view of what you can do with AI in practical terms and talk through some real-world examples. Just a bit of an intro. So my background is in engineering and building products. I used to be an academic that came to industry. Recently co-founded Open Dialog AI, which is a platform to help you build conversational AI solutions. And I have a dog that occupies a lot of my time. I also have a family, but he cares more about me. So Open Dialog, just very quickly, is a platform to help you build conversational AI solutions, and we'll talk about what that is and what that means. Now, I'll do two things. I'll talk about conversational AI and why it's important, and I think it's interesting in listening about all these challenges around finding people and keeping people and so on. Automation is kind of an obvious next step to consider. And then I'll give you three examples, and I've graded them. And this is how we like to approach things with clients. So you can't just jump to the very best that you could get with conversational AI. It's a journey. So you walk, you run, you fly, and we'll look at three examples of that type. Okay, what is conversational AI? Let's start with what is AI, right? And there is definitely, if I spent a lot of time in the past 3 years fighting the snake oil that comes from a lot of AI vendors, because they like to anthropomorphize it and humanize it and say, look, it's like a little kid and you teach it and it will learn and it will understand. It's not magic. AI is a set of technologies, tools, and it allows us to create software that can take some of what humans used to do and do it automatically, right? So you can take some of the decision making that humans used to do, not all of it, and make that happen automatically, right? Now, conversational AI is that bit of AI that does it for conversations. So we mentioned contact centers. How can you have a conversation where a person calls in, but on the other end, it's not a human being. It's a bit of software that is trying to understand what the user said and deal with it as best as it can. And if it cannot deal with it, then decide what is the appropriate person to hand this conversation over, right? So as to limit the overall weight that goes through a contact center. And just as a very quick example of what conversational AI tries to do. So as humans, our language is incredibly rich. So if we want to say something simple like, I need help, we have a whole bunch of ways that we could say it, right? So we could say, I'm not sure what to do, I'm confused, can someone help me, what happens now, and so on. We have all these different ways of saying, I need help. And the job of conversational AI, or one of its jobs, is to take all those phrases and say, look, the user is actually asking for help, what you should do, right? So that's the broad context. Now, why is this important? I think of it in terms of places, so location, location, location. First of all, conversations, and especially through messaging apps, is what we do all the time. And the younger the public skews, the more conversations they're having through messaging apps. So it's really important to be able to be where they are, right? I think the latest numbers is something like 5 billion people are on messaging apps and use them intensively multiple times every day. Voice tech is becoming increasingly more popular. And so I have two kids, a girl who's 15 and a boy who is 5. And it's the iPhone and the voice person. So my daughter was born 15 years ago. At some point, touch screens came out, and by the time she was 5 or 6, she would just assume everything is touch enabled. So I'm sure you've experienced this if you have kids. They'll walk up to the TV and touch it because everything should be touch screen enabled. The younger one is used to voice. So he will talk to the screen, right? And obviously my home probably skews a bit more towards Alexa and stuff like that, but he just assumes that things will respond to voice commands, right? So this is where the world is going. And then the other thing is, with automation, you can actually serve people around the clock, around the world, and so on. So that it's where users are. It's also where work happens. We do work, hate it or love it, we do work in messaging applications, right? Whether it's Teams or Slack or Facebook Workspace or something like that. We do work there, and there is automation that we can insert there. We can deal with our internal service requests of what's the password for this thing? How do I reset my password? How do I get Wi-Fi? Is this office going to be open? And so on. All those internal service questions can be automated and handled by conversational AI. So it's where users are, it's where work happens. And then for me, the most important thing, it's where the future is, right? And this is the fundamental driver for me for conversational AI. So ever since Steve Jobs stood up and presented the graphical user interface, the way we interact with machines is we look at the screen and there's buttons and menus and we have to figure out what is this thing going to do. Basically, we have to learn it to then use it. Voice flips that around, right? Conversations flip that around. You say what you want and the machine has to react to it. And that is such a huge change in how you interact with machines, and it can enable all sorts of basic fundamental improvements of how you do things. So this is why conversational AI is really important. It gets you to where people are in all those messaging apps at any time they want to interact with it. It's where we do work constantly by exchanging messages, and it's a fundamentally different way of interacting with technology. Okay, so real-world examples. First one is walking. So it's taking an existing process, something that you already do, and do it better via conversational AI. And this is a project that we did with a company called MyMed&Me. One of their clients is Bayer. And one of the things that all pharmaceuticals need to do is provide easy-to-use ways for people to report when there is an issue with some of the drugs they're taking, right? So pharmaceuticals need to provide this easy-to-use ways. At the other end, they want actionable data, so they need clear data so they actually understand what has happened. Is this a real issue? Do we need to react to it? And all this in a context that's extremely regulated because we're dealing about health data. So what was their first solution to this? Forms, right? Here's a bunch of forms with a bunch of fields, fill it in, try and figure out what's going to happen, and if something goes wrong, well, I hope it turns out okay for you. What we did is take that journey and turn it into a conversation. Right, so at every step of the journey, you're only presented with the bit of information that you need to know for that bit of the journey. And you can also shape these journeys for different types of users. So if we're talking to a medical professional, it's one sort of conversation. If it's a caretaker reporting something on behalf of someone else, it's another type of conversation. And obviously, if it's the person themselves reporting it, it's something different. Now, the outcome is improved quality of data, so the information that you actually get is much better. The satisfaction from a customer perspective in terms of I was able to solve my problem improves. And it's a very positive thing in this case for Bayer to be doing, to say, look, there's this thing that we're obliged to do, but we're actually going an extra step and doing it in a much better way. So this was the first example in terms of taking an existing process and improving it through conversational AI. And then I should say, from the AI perspective, the main improvement here is personalization and just a better conversational journey. There's not necessarily a lot of complicated machine learning. So it's an easy first step to take. Find a process, that can do with some improvement and convert it into a conversation. Now, this second one is once you're ready to start running, right? And it's about creating new opportunities through conversational AI. The client in this case is BDO. So BDO is a large accounting firm. We've been working with them in Switzerland. And the problem that we're having is there's a bunch of small to medium-sized enterprises in Switzerland that would like to use BDO, but BDO is too expensive for them, right? Because they have to use their auditors and so on, and it just didn't make sense as a business proposition. Now, when they did it, the way they did it, and I'm sure you'll all recognize this process, is a bunch of emails going back and forth around the audit, together with meetings where you would go through spreadsheets with a bunch of questions and try to solve all of this and tie it together, right? So it's very laborious, human intensive, and so on. And what we did is rethink that process. So you take the audit process, and the audit process is something that involves the small audits are hundreds of questions. So you're not going to have that as a conversation with an automated tool, right? That's way too complicated. You want the humans to do that. But you put it in a tool that has conversational automation in it, and the job of that virtual assistant is to make the entire process much more fluid. So if you're the auditee, as you're going through your audit and you have a question around, is this VAT rule for this specific area of Switzerland still an active rule and so on, instead of having to write an email, stop everything, then wait for the answer from the auditor and so on, you can just ask a virtual assistant, right? And they'll provide an answer. Once you're done with a bit of it, and it actually does need to go to the auditor, it's the virtual assistant that will handle the back and forth. You know, the client is done, you need to do something else, have you already done it, message the client. So it's all the easy things that you don't want expensive professionals or any human really to be wasting time with, that you can automate, and the rest you let the humans focus on, which is the real value addition. So the result for this, for BDO, was transformational in that they can now introduce a new product in the market, which is a whole new, they're very used to selling services, and this is really selling a product. You're essentially onboarding clients onto this digital audit experience with a virtual assistant to help them solve problems. So this is a good example for me in terms of running, right? You are creating a whole new opportunity that wasn't there before because you've introduced automation, and there was no other way to do this. Now, last example is flying, and this is about redefining how an entire industry works, right? And while the other two are live examples, this one we're in the process of doing, right? So we're working with an insurance company in the UK, a startup called Peppercorn. And the challenge they've set themselves is, how can we do insurance differently with automation built in from the start? And what's really interesting about this, and where they can really benefit, is they have no baggage, right? They have no existing systems, existing processes. They can completely rethink how insurance happens. Now, the problem they're trying to solve for people is trying to buy an insurance now, even if you're doing that online, and that's a screenshot from confused.com, is just a slow, laborious process, right? Again, we're back in lots of forms, lots of different things to read through, and some of it is regulated. You can't actually avoid it. It just has to happen that way. But the bit that is really missing is live, instant assistance for the user specific to their problem, right? So not some generic answer from an FAQ that says, here's how this might work, try and figure out if it fits your situation, but a specific answer to your specific question. That's what's going to really unblock things and get users moving quickly. So what we're doing with Peppercorn is building this experience with a virtual assistant from the get-go. So in 2 to 3 months, when you go on confused.com, you'll see that little peppercorn logo pop up. Please click on it, help our clients. And you'll be greeted by the Peppercorn digital assistant that's going to guide you through the process and also provide support through the entire process. And the objective is better prices for the people buying the insurance, a much better customer experience, much lower cost in terms of running an insurance, and an almost unintended consequence, but incredibly significant, less impact on the environment, right? Because if you can do this whole thing with a lot of automation built in, this is a carbon negative activity, and Peppercorn is actually doing the work to document that clearly and be able to demonstrate it. So a huge change in terms of how this happens. Okay, so first you crawl, and I skipped the crawl bit. Then you learn to walk, then you run, and then you can fly and completely redefine how things happen. But it is a process that you need to go through. And if you try and go straight to the end, it typically doesn't work. And we've tried it, and it's really too much to bite off. You kind of have to get everyone up to speed with how these things work. Apologies for the incredibly messy diagram here, but I thought it was important to illustrate in some way. So typically organizations start with some historical data and understanding, right? And they'll apply some automation. It could be conversational, it could be something else, and that will lead to an augmented standard process, right? So that's the walking bit. What's really interesting and what's really valuable once you start doing this is once you have an augmented standard process that goes through automation, you have much, much better data and understanding of what is happening. I was pleased, but also not surprised to hear from John Lewis that speech analytics, despite all the snake oil, speech analytics was really useful, right? Because that data is incredibly valuable. So that can lead to better data, which can then feed back into your standard processes and keep improving them. But it can also indicate how you can create new processes and new opportunities, right? So it's a big word, but it is an exponential change in how you do business. And that's the organizations that understand this and capture it are really taking off. And again, it will seem like a big statement, but that's why the big tech companies are so successful and so efficient, because they live in this process. That is built into their DNA. And other organizations need to catch up and work like that, because if we don't, and I really believe this is not like a sales pitch, there is going to be a marked difference between the organizations that invest in automation and conversational automation and have all that extra data and analytics about what happens within their business, and those that don't. And those that don't will then find it increasingly harder to catch up. Okay, that's it. Thank you.